Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar hosted by Mind Solutions on Understand the Code of Wages 2019. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules and to attend the webinar. A very warm welcome also to Mr. Anil Bhatt and Mr. Chandra Singh. Mr. Chandra Singh is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India and a very well-known legal luminary in our country. He has made immense contributions in the area of labor laws. Mr. Anil Bhatt is an employment law specialist with extensive experience in handling complex HR-related issues. He represents Government of India as a standing counsel for service matters. He also works very closely with international law firms, consulting firms, international business houses on employment law. Gentlemen, it's an absolute honor to have you, and thank you for your valuable time on this webinar. My name is Samir Kargatkai. I serve as the Vice President at Mind Solutions. I also lead the business in the West and Southern regions. With your permission, sirs, I will take a few minutes, and I promise only a few, introducing Mind Solutions to our audience on the webinar. Co-founded by Sandeep Mahindra Vivek Mishra, we've been in business for 18 years. We're one of the very, very few business houses that focus both on HR and finance outsourcing services under a single roof. We're headquartered in Gurgaon, 1,200 motivated employees strong, servicing over 500 customers and present across the country. Saurabh Vadhva serves as our COO. I'm just trying to get Give me a minute, I'm just trying to move the slides. Shivam, sorry, I'm not able to move my slides. Just give me a second.
Oh, what happened?
Yeah, no, I don't. We have followed an inch wide and a mile deep strategy that's focused on HR and finance outsourcing services. We've created and developed deep SME expertise in both these areas, backed by in-house development technology platforms. These platforms are born out of our unique vantage point from serving more than 500 clients across multiple industries. We deeply value and invest in our client relationships. Our clients have played a very significant role in our growth and evolution as an organization. We're grateful for their support and partnership. Our new identity is reflecting our new logo. It's Intelligence Automated. Our new identity reflects our evolution from being just an outsourcing company to a tech-enabled finance and HR solutions provider, offering a seamless blend of human and artificial intelligence. As I mentioned earlier, our services today focus on finance and outsourcing services and HR outsourcing services. We also have M1. M1 is an RBI-approved threats platform set up by Mind Solutions in 2007. It's only one of the 3 licensed platforms by RBI set up in 2017. It's an institutional mechanism to facilitate the financing of trade receivables through factoring, reverse factoring, and to micro, small, and medium enterprises, from corporate buyers through a bidding process by participating banks and NBFCs. The exchange facilitates discounting of invoices and bills of exchange on factoring on a pan-India basis. So that's our solution set as Mind Solutions. I'll give you an idea of the volumes. Obviously, we deliver very large volumes across both HR and finance services, across 500 plus customers, and they are across industries. Our HR solutions, I've spent a little time on HR and finance solutions. Our HR solutions cover both payroll in the domestic and international space, compliance management, HRIS solutions, and staffing solutions. Compliances, primarily, we are able to serve today payroll, establishment, health and safety, factory compliances, and labor compliances. These are services provided across the country. The HR and finance solutions are a blend of deep subject matter expertise, and they are focusing on receivables, payables, fixed assets management, and accounting. We have a full-fledged and shared service capabilities that is aimed to meet client business objective as well as cost optimization goals. The HR and finance solutions. Just 1 minute. Yes, sir. Am I still audible to everybody? The HR and finance solutions are a blend of deep subject matter expertise and intelligent automation that are focused on delivering value outcomes for our customers. On the slide now, if you can see it, it's a tech suite. Our expansive tech suite is a backbone of our services to our clients. All the tech is developed and managed in-house through our in-house tech teams led by our CIO, Vipin Sawhney. They continuously upgraded and meet ever evolving client needs. The tech forms an integral part of our managed services solution to clients and are also provided as SaaS products. I'm going to spend a little time on the compliance management services specifically, since we're talking about compliances today. And before I hand over to Mr. Bhatt, our compliance management services are based on a zero risk, value and advisory-led compliance services for our customers. They have only one objective: to ensure that the customers stay compliant. The services is led by a front-end team of experts, delivered through a pan-India service delivery team and backed by a unique in-house built platform. The service, as you can see, is end-to-end that covers licensing with authorities, managing inspections, registrations, renewals, and it's across the board. As you can see, it's an end-to-end managed services solution. Yeah, Dinesh. Act is our in-house tool. We've automated, it's able to automate and generate all the compliances through the tool based on base payroll data. So before I hand over to Mr. Bhatt, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about the session. Firstly, if you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to send it through the Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen or by tweeting us at Mindsoul. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session. If you don't get your questions today, we will sure to get back to you with a reply later. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick off things by welcoming Mr. Bhatt. Over to you, sir, Mr. Bhatt.
Not audible. Mr. Bhatt, you're not audible.
Oh, Mr. Bhatt, you're not audible, sir.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a much needed webinar on a very hot topic, that's the Code on Wages 2019. We all have been hearing about the codification of labor laws for quite some time, and codification into four. That's Code on Wages, Code on Social Security, Code on Industrial Relations, Code on Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions. And as of now, Code on Wages has already been passed by the Parliament and has also received the assent from Honorable President. Rules under the code has also been notified on 7th of July 2020. And we will have to wait for 45 days from that day. And a new final notification will be issued for the effective date of the code. So it's my personal delight that today Mr. C.U. Singh, Chandrauday Singh, has kindly consented to speak on the issue today. Mr. Singh does not need any introduction. All the employment law practitioners, the veterans, people who work on the subject labor laws, they know him he has made immense contribution. We have been witness to the mesmerizing code crafting, in-depth knowledge on labor laws, and above all, the understanding of the processes of industry. Mr. Chandrodaya Singh has started his actually practice from Mumbai, and now he is permanently posted in Delhi in Supreme Court. And to our all grievance that he's not now available for high courts. So I have always been, speaking to him on this. So you will find the judgments, the very important, proposition of law, where the high courts and Supreme Court has settled law. So his contribution has also been there always. Not taking much time further, I would request Mr. Singh to enlighten all of us on this new code, talking about salient features of the code, the employer's compliances requirement, the challenges he has observed that we may, as employers, may face. And I would request all the participants to patiently, this is an opportunity for all of us. We have always been, like students, learning at a distance, or I have had an opportunity to work with him on very important issues. So we have a very beautiful opportunity today to listen to him, understand the nuances of the new law. And if you have questions, you may park the questions for a while. After Mr. Singh is through with his, what he speaks on the issue, then you can write down the questions. Then I can one by one pass on the questions to Mr. Singh, and he can really explain it further. So I would request Mr. Singh to please take it forward.
Thank you, Anil. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really humbled by the praise that my good friend Mr. Anil Bhatt has lavished on me. I'm also really thrilled to be speaking before such a large audience. I understand that there are hundreds of you gathered for this on a Friday afternoon. I'm really grateful to you. So let me straight away get to the wages and bonus code. As Anil said, this promises to be the first of 4 or 5 codes which would it was intended that there could be a codification and a simplification of the fact that we have a plethora of employment laws in India running into, at the parliamentary level, perhaps 30 or 40 of them, and every state has their own laws, and plus the parliamentary laws have state amendments. So it is actually quite a quicksand, a morass of laws at the moment. So on paper, this came across as a really good initiative of the government to codify the laws. So, but a lot will turn, I guess, on how the first one of the series works out, and if this makes a good impact, then it would galvanize the parliament into drawing up a series of really good codified laws. So let me straight away start by saying that unfortunately I found that this the code on wages and bonus, the first of the lot, 2019, is it leaves a lot to be desired. But I would split it up into actually. Well, it's a funny thing, but it reminded me of a film which I saw in my school days, or immediately after school. There was a Western movie starring Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach, if I remember right. And the name of the movie was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And this code really, funnily enough, reminds me of that, because it has its parts which are really, really good. And then it has, just a second. Hello? Not audible. Oh, one sec. Am I audible now? Am I audible? Yes, I think people are saying I'm audible now. Well, would you should I start? I'll just flash back a little bit. What I was saying was that the code on wages and labor it reminds me.
Brothers?
Some people are not able to hear me, but most seem to be hearing me from the chats that I am seeing on the right of the screen. So shall I proceed? Yes. Yeah. So as I said, I was saying that this code it's a harbinger of really good things to come, because hopefully there will be a whole series of codes which will get rid of this plethora of laws that we have in labor and employment in the labor and employment sphere. But being the very first one, it's very important that this code must play out well and must fulfill the objective which was set for it. And when I was reading the code as a whole, it really reminded me of a film that I saw in my late school days, or perhaps right after school, which was a Western movie starring Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef, called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And this was what they used to call a spaghetti western in those days, a brilliant movie, and one of Clint Eastwood's early movies. But when I saw the code, it really reminded me of that because it has some very, very good provisions in it. It has a lot of bad provisions which seem to stem from poor legislative draftsmanship. And it has some really ugly provisions in the sense that there are provisions which really have no place at all in a code which is trying to, where the government claims to be trying to improve the ease of doing business and so on. There are some provisions which are patently ugly. But before I start analyzing the provisions of the code, let me give you a broad overview of it. So basically, the code on wages and bonus seeks to replace four labor laws, which are the Payment of Wages Act 1936, the Payment of Bonus Act 1965, the Minimum Wages Act 1948, and the Equal Remuneration Act 1976. So these four laws have been are sought to be replaced by the code. And what it does basically is it repeals all these, once the code is brought into force, once the rules are brought into force and the code is formally takes the field, then it will automatically repeal the Payment of Wages Act, Minimum Wages Act, Payment of Bonus Act, and Equal Remuneration Act. So let me give you an overview of the code. Chapter 1 of the code contains all the usual provisions, the enforcement, the commencement provision, as well as the application. Section 2 contains all the definitions, and section 3, which is strangely enough part of chapter 1, deals with the Equal Remuneration Act, or rather a broader concept of gender discrimination, because this act goes beyond the Equal Remuneration Act and deals with gender discrimination on a broader platform. But that comes in chapter 1. Chapter 2, which is section 5 to 14, deals with minimum wages and replace the Minimum Wages Act in effect. Chapter 3, section 15 to 25, deal with the payment of wages, issue of payment of wages, and effectively replaces the Payment of Wages Act. Chapter 4, sections 26 to 41 deal with payment of bonus and replace the Payment of Bonus Act. Chapter 5 is a single section chapter which has section 42, which deals with two advisory boards. One advisory board, which is a central advisory board, one advisory board, which is a state advisory board. And these advisory boards are basically mostly for minimum wages, but also for certain other issues like equivalence of jobs, etc. Chapter 6, then sections 43 to 50 deal with the manner of payment of dues, claims, audits, etc. For the purpose of arriving at bonus and so on. There are certain audit provisions and so on set out. And then chapter 8 is section 51, which creates something called an inspector cum facilitator, which is supposedly to replace the Inspector Raj, but as I'll discuss a little later, it does just the opposite. Chapter 8, sections 52 to 56 deals with offences and penalties. And chapter 9 is the final chapter, which is sections 57 to 69, which are the miscellaneous provisions. And 69 is the repealing provision, which repeals those 4 acts which I mentioned. So this is a broad overview of the wages and code on wages and bonus. Now let me come back to what I was saying about those provisions which broadly are very, very welcome provisions, very good provisions, well drafted, and which seem to fulfill the purposes of the statute. So taking the good first, it's always good to take good news first. So let's look at the good news here. The first, of course, is that there is consolidation. This code results in consolidating 4 laws which had disparate definitions. They had a disparate coverage. They would tend to, each law would cover a different set of people. Sometimes they would overlap, sometimes they would not overlap, and so on. So here is a case where the consolidation, at least as far as these 4 laws are concerned, there are common definitions, common coverage, a common scope, etc., which is itself a very good thing, because in the long run, it should lead to less litigation, less divergence of views of different high courts, and so on and so forth. Most importantly, that there should be less conflict in decision making and trouble in trying to resolve issues, because half the problem which arise with many of our labor and industrial laws are the definitions. When you have different definitions in different laws, the same employee is defined as an employee in one place, worker in one place, workman in another place, and so on and so forth. And there are so many different ways. The employer is defined differently in each and every law, and that tends to lead to a lot of confusion. So that itself is something very salutary, and it's a good provision, very very welcome provision of doing this. Now, if they did the same thing with employment laws which deal with the cessation of employment, for instance, the Industrial Disputes Act, the various state laws which deal with the like UP Industrial Disputes Act, MP Industrial Relations Act, Maharashtra Industrial Relations Act, etc., if they were consolidated, and all laws dealing with employment, termination, retrenchment, etc., were made uniform, that would also go a long way. Similarly, there should be codification done in all the different laws. Now, coming to one provision which some people might, some employers, especially some of the smaller employers, might find this difficult to deal with or might not welcome this. But in my view, on a national basis, for a country that wants to move forward and play a global role, etc., I think what is one of the best provisions in this law is that it has the potential of giving a very big boost to women in the workplace. There are just 2 or 3 sections, but those 2 or 3 sections have a sweeping potential. Now, whether the potential is realized or not is a different matter, but while replacing the Equal Remuneration Act, what the code has done is that it has provided for 2 things. 1, complete prohibition on gender discrimination. 2, equality even in recruitment in manning posts. Now, that is something which has never been done as far as I'm aware in the past, and Equal Remuneration Act also didn't deal with that. But what the code does is that in Section 3, Section 3 is in two parts. 3.1 says there shall be no discrimination in an establishment or any unit thereof among employees on the ground of gender in matters relating to wages by the same employer in respect of the same work or work of a similar nature done by any employee. Now, this one subsection virtually covers the Equal Remuneration Act in a sense. It broadly brings in the concept of equal remuneration in a very pithy, very neat, very simple to understand subsection 1. Now, subsection 2, which as I said, some employers might find unpalatable, but I personally think it's a very salutary provision. Subsection 2 of section 3 says, no employer shall, for the purposes of complying with subsection 1, reduce the rate of wages of any employee. In other words, because you don't want to discriminate, you can't reduce a man's wages to bring him down to the level of a woman. You have to raise the lady employees' wages up on par with men and not the other way around. So this is, that's okay. That's a fairly straightforward provision. But sub 3.2 subclause 2 says no employer shall make any discrimination on the ground of sex while recruiting any employee for the same work or work of similar nature and in the conditions of employment, except where the employment of women in such work is prohibited or restricted by or under any law for the time being in force. Now, this is a very interesting provision, because it says no employer will make any discrimination on gender basis while recruiting any employee. So if you're going to recruit for the same work or work of a similar nature, you have to have a level playing field among the candidates who come up before the employer, and the employer cannot discriminate on the ground of gender or sex at the time of recruitment. Now, why do I say that this is a very far-reaching provision? Because ultimately it will depend on the implementation. Because if it is not implemented, or if it is dodged by employers, it might be difficult for the government to regulate it, because it's very difficult at the stage of recruitment to know how many people applied, whether they had the same qualifications, whether they were rightly or wrongly not selected, etc. But where this has a very far-reaching effect is that section 3, which deals with gender discrimination, talks about employees and not workers. Now, this is important because this code has two different classes of people who are covered. It has a definition of employee, which is found in section 2K, 2 small k, employee, and it has a definition of worker, which is in 2Z. Now, the difference is this: employee covers everybody, including managerial, administrative, etc., as well as any person declared to be an employee by the appropriate government. So section 2K, if I can just take a second to glance at that, it says employee means any person other than an apprentice under the Apprentices Act, employed on wages by an establishment to do any skilled, semi-skilled or unskilled manual, operational, supervisory, managerial, administrative, technical or clerical work for hire or reward, and also includes a person declared to be an employee by the appropriate government. So section 3, which forbids gender discrimination and which says that there will be a level playing field in recruitment, applies to employee and not to worker, because worker in 2Z is more or less like a workman under the Industrial Disputes Act, because worker says the definition for worker is means any person other than an apprentice employed in any industry to do any manual, unskilled, skilled, technical, operational, clerical or supervisory work, etc. And this does not include managerial, administrative, etc. So it is only skilled, unskilled, technical, operational, clerical or supervisory work for hire or reward. And it expressly excludes persons employed in managerial, administrative or supervisory capacity and supervisors who earn more than 15,000 rupees per month. So section 3, as I said, is one of the provisions which might be difficult for very small employers like shops and small establishments with 2 employees, 5 employees, 10 employees might be difficult for them. But overall, in the interest of the nation and in the interest of building up the employment potential of women who make up half the population of this country and who are seriously underrepresented, very, very severely underrepresented in all levels of employment. I think this is one of the great provisions in the code. The other, a couple of other provisions. There are numerous provisions, but one can't cover all of them in the space of this talk. But one of the other interesting provisions is the inclusion of working journalists and sales promotion employees in the definition of worker. In 2Z, now when dealing with worker as opposed to employee, it says worker means so and so, so and so, and includes working journalists as defined in the Working Journalists Act and sales promotion employees as defined in the Sales Promotion Conditions of Service Act 1976. And also those who are dismissed, discharged, etc., etc. As in the Industrial Disputes Act, they are also covered. So what is interesting about this is that all these laws like sales promotion employees, etc., it was very difficult for them to get the benefit of regular payment of wages and so on. Now I'm not talking about some of the very favored sales promotion employees as in the case of medical representatives. Take out medical representatives for a moment, because that is one class who are by and large very well looked after. Almost some would say they are virtually pampered, and they are very powerful because their organizations are exceedingly powerful and so on. But a normal sales promotion employee, the type of person who goes around with pens and pencils and notebooks and tries to sell them from door to door, or a person who is promoting sales of small electronic items or XYZ, whatever it may be. Those sales promotion employees who go from shop to shop to through walking through markets, trudging through markets to book orders for their employers of small household items, plastic buckets, etc., whatever it may be. Now, most of them, or there's a large population of them who only get commission. They get no wages at all. They are virtually working only. And if they are unwell for 5 days, at the end of it, 5 days they earn nothing and so on. So I think it's a salutary provision to bring them in here. Sales promotion employees, working journalists have a Working Journalists Act already, but I think for bonuses, wages, minimum wages, etc., it's a good idea to have these people so that all the classes of employees of every in every walk of life kind of get covered as far as these 4 statutes are concerned. That is gender discrimination, payment of wages, payment of bonus, and minimum wages. So this is another good provision in this code. One more which struck me was that in the chapter dealing with bonus, under section 38, there is a provision that bonus can be withheld. The normal annual bonus, profit-based bonus, which is covered under this code, can be withheld in the case of a person who commits misconduct which leads to financial loss. So there is this is something which if I remember right, I don't think it's there in the 1965 Payment of Bonus Act. It's there in the Payment of Gratuity Act, but you have to prove the loss, you have to correlate the loss, and you can withhold gratuity only to the extent of the loss, which is very, very difficult to do. Here, if a misconduct is committed which leads to financial loss, bonus can be forfeited under Section 38. Another good provision. So these are broadly some of the good areas covered by the Act, and I would stress again, of course, the broad thing of consolidation. That is one of the most important aspects, is consolidating all the laws and so on. It's a good and a very salutary provision. Now let me come to the bad, because we are going with the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you remember. So now, what is the starting point of what is bad about this code is that there is terrible legislative draftsmanship. Sometimes what happens is, if you try to be all things to all people, it can lead to a khichdi. And this is one of those unfortunate situations where in trying to cover everything in 4 laws and to bring in each and every some thought processes which may have been generated by different interest groups or something. The legislative draftsmanship, I think, leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, just for instance, just to give you a few examples, the definition of wages in which is found in section 2, subsection Y. Now, wages means all remuneration, etc., usual thing, includes basic pay, dearness allowance, etc., etc. But wages does not include, and some of those usual exclusions which we are all used to, like any bonus payable, value of house accommodation, any contribution paid to a pension fund, provident fund, etc., any conveyance allowance, and so on. But wages also, it says, any conveyance allowance, value of any traveling concession, any sum paid to the employed person to defray special expenses, any house rent allowance, fair enough. Now, G, subclause G of 2Y says, wages does not include any remuneration payable under any award or settlement between the parties or order of a court or tribunal. Now, this is something really weird, because if there's an industrial award and the award has fixed the wages for an industry, let's say there's a wage adjudication and wages are fixed for the entire industry. This says wages will not include remuneration which is payable under the award. So the entire award will cease to be what is wages under the award will cease to be wages under this act, and it will not be enforceable under this act. So suddenly, when somebody goes to seek wages which are under payable under any award or under any settlement, now in most of the organized sector industry, wages are only payable under settlements or awards. Wages are not the original wages which you sign on when you sign your contract, when you sign your letter of employment. Within a few years, get replaced by a settlement, by the negotiated settlement, or by an award. And then ultimately, the entire wage pattern in that industry is only then governed by, in that unit or in that establishment, is only governed by either settlements with the trade unions or awards of tribunals. And here it says it does not include remuneration payable under any award or settlement between the parties or order of a court or tribunal. Similarly, this goes on to add, the definition of wages goes on to add 2 provisos and an explanation. And frankly, I just could not, for the life of me, fathom what these provisos do. Because the first proviso says that provided for calculating the wages under this clause, if payments made by the employer to the employee under clauses A to I exceeds 1/2 of such other percentage may be notified by the central government of all the remuneration calculated under this clause, the amount which exceeds 1/2 of the percent so notified shall be deemed as remuneration and shall be accordingly added to wages. So first they say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K are excluded. Then they say, but if whatever is payable under A to under so and so, that is A to I of that exceeds half the wages, then whatever is in excess of half will come back in. So the intention must be that you can make allowances, exclude some allowances, but don't let the exclusion go very high. So the inclusion shouldn't be more than half. But you have in G, you say remuneration payable under an award is not wages at all. Now, if remuneration payable under an award is not wages and you bring it back, it is bound to be more than half, because it will be 100%. So only 50% of that will become wages. I mean, there's some, it really boggles the imagination of how this draftsmanship was done. Second proviso says, provided further that for the purpose of equal wages to all genders and for the purpose of payment of wages, the emoluments in D, F, G, and H shall be taken for computation of wages. So certain emoluments for equality only will be treated as wages, but for, other than equality, they won't be treated as wages. So if there's a gender discrimination, only then you look at those. Otherwise, they are not wages. Then there's an explanation which says that where where an employee is given in lieu of the whole or part of wages any remuneration in kind or by his employer, the value of remuneration in kind which does not exceed 15% of total wages shall be deemed to form part of the wages of such employee. So if you get wages in kind, the first 15% will get added back into your wages. Whatever is more than 15% won't get. I mean, really, as I said, it's appalling. Similarly, there are several other definitions and all, which, I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but really, it is unfortunate that that such sloppy draftsmanship is there, which is bound to lead to difficulties as we go on, because just understanding this exclusion, then coupled with inclusion, then partial exclusion, then partial inclusion, and so on, is going to be a nightmare for anybody. The other one provision which I think is whether it's done by design or by accident, but it's not. I think it's a really bad provision, because I think it goes against the ethos which we should be inculcating among our workers, among our employees, and among even employers. And that is that Section 37 of this Act, which deals with bonus, it gives credit for puja bonus and customary bonus. In other words, Section 37 provides that if an employer has paid puja bonus or customary bonus, then that puja or customary bonus, to the extent of payment, will be deductible from the profit bonus which is payable under this code. Fair enough. There's absolutely no exception to be taken. I totally agree with that provision. But what they have missed is productivity bonus or production linked bonus or production bonus. Now, it was felt that as we go forward as a nation, it is very important to wean away bonus from profit alone and to try and bring productivity linked or production linked bonuses, so that there is an incentive to employees to produce more and they get paid more as a result of that incentive. Now, so in the Payment of Bonus Act, 1965 was amended and 31 capital A was added in that, specifically to bring in production linked bonus, and to say that if production linked bonus has been paid under a settlement or under an award, then that production linked bonus will be, and as provided the production linked bonus is not less than the minimum bonus payable, which used to be 8.33% under the 1965 Act, then as long as it is not less than minimum bonus, the production linked bonus will substitute or stand in place of the profit linked bonus under the Act. That has completely gone. In this code, unfortunately, there is no parallel of 31 capital A of the 1965 Act, and the only credit which an employer can get is for puja bonus or customary bonus, but no credit. Even if you have given production bonus, you'll still have to pay a profit bonus over and above that. So, in fact, this is a disincentive for production or productivity linked bonuses. I think this is a provision which really ought to be there. One more aspect is that there are two advisory boards, as I said in Chapter 5 under Section 42. There's a central advisory board and there are state advisory boards. Now, central advisory board would have been expected would deal with those industries that the appropriate government is central government, or they might deal with certain broad policy issues of the central government. But what they have done here is they have provided in 42 subsection 3 that the central advisory board can advise the central government on various issues, and upon this advice being given, the advice of the central advisory board will be binding on the state advisory boards. Now, this I think is really goes against the federal federalism, as well as the fact that labor and employment is under the concurrent list. Both states and center legislate on it. In this act itself, there is appropriate government. For certain industries, it is central government. For certain industries, it is state government. So, to say that the central, because the wording here used is the central advisory board shall from time to time advise the central government on reference of issues such as so and so, And on such advice, the central government may issue directions to state government as it deems fit in respect of matters relating to the issues referred to the board. So the moment the central government issues a direction, it is binding on the state advisory board, and state advisory board becomes just a paper tiger or a paper entity. Again, a provision which I think really ought not to be there. Now, interestingly, one of the aspects on which the central advisory board can give advice is on providing increasing employment opportunities for women. Now, I don't know why they did not just have the same provision for state advisory board and central advisory board, because there may be a case where a particular state is very progressive. That state wants to increase employment opportunities for women and wants to go in that direction. Central advisory board doesn't do it. But they've given this power to central advisory board, but not to the state advisory board. So there's something lacking in this particular provision also. And that lastly brings me to what I loosely characterize as the ugly. In the good, the bad, and the ugly, we now come to those provisions of the code which I personally find very repulsive, very repugnant, and very ugly. The first of these is that in chapter 6, which deals with payment of dues, claims, and audit, this is a sort of a machinery chapter which provides all the machinery for implementation of the various provisions of this code. Now, in chapter 6, there is a section 45, and section 43 says that every employer shall be required to pay what is payable under the code. If he fails to pay, then the proprietor and the company shall be liable, and so on and so forth. Then there are some good provisions for nomination in section 44, which is excellent. That normally we used to have a nominee in Provident Fund. We might have a nominee in certain laws only. But here there's a general nomination across the board. So whether it's for bonus, whether it's for wages, whether it's for minimum wages, whatever, there's a nominee available, and whatever, if the workman is not available, the employee is not available, it goes to the nominee. Now, coming to so that should have gone in the good, but I missed that out. Now, coming to what I said was the ugly. Section 45 says basically that the appropriate government may by notification appoint one or more authorities not below the rank of a gazetted officer to hear and determine claims which arise under the provision of this code. Now, this is something really which goes against, totally against the grain, because to hear and determine claims is a judicial function or a quasi-judicial function. It has been held time and again by the Supreme Court and by various high courts that when functions which were traditionally done by judicial officers and all these laws are sought to be taken away and given to a government officer, that would violate Articles 234, 235, 236 of the Constitution of India, because there is a sort of a broad separation between the judiciary and the executive. And judicial functions can only be done by those who have trained legal minds, who are persons trained and who are eligible to be or qualified to be a judge of a high court and so on, which is the normal qualification to man any tribunal. Now, here they say that the determination of claims and settlement of disputes on claims will be by a gazetted officer. And then section 49 goes further, and this section 45, by the way, gives full power of a civil court to that officer, to summon papers, documents, etc., 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 and record evidence and so on. Section 49 provides for a statutory appeal from the determination under section 45. And who does this appeal go to? The appeal goes to an officer who's one rank above the officer, the gazetted officer designated under section 45. So a gazetted officer can be, at the lowest rung of class 1, or even some of the top level of class 2 might be a gazetted officer, but certainly the lowest level of class 1 would be a gazetted officer. And an appeal will go to a person who's just one rank above that person. So now you don't even have an appeal before a judicial or quasi-judicial, proper judicial forum. So this provision, I think, it just won't fly. There is, I recall that they tried to do a similar thing with the Maharashtra Recognition of Trade Unions and Bombay Industrial Relations Act and all. They tried to have labor courts and all, which were directly from gazetted officers. and that was struck down by the Bombay High Court and the Supreme Court in state of Maharashtra versus Labour Law Practitioners Association, Bombay, in 1998, two Supreme Court cases, 688. Supreme Court upheld the judgment of Bombay High Court and said you cannot man these tribunals by government officers. This is absolutely abhorrent to the Constitution. More recently, in 2010, in the case of Union of India versus R. Gandhi, President of Madras Bar Association, 2010-11 SCC page 1, a constitution bench of 5 judges struck down the provisions of the National Company Law Tribunal Act, which allowed appointment of a non-judicial officer to man the NCLTs, the Company Law Tribunals, because they said when these tribunals are replacing the Company Law Board and the High Courts, where the Company Court which was in the High Court, they cannot be manned by a government officer. This is completely abhorrent to all notions. So this 45 and 49, I think, are completely obnoxious provisions, and I have my own feeling is that in all likelihood they will be challenged at some stage and they will be struck down. Another provision which I ought to have put it in the category of bad and not ugly is Section 50, which deals with records and filing and maintenance of records and filing of returns. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that this act does not have any minimum threshold for employers. So an employer, even a shop with 2 employees, will be an employer within the meaning of this act. Even a small office with 4 employees will be an employer within the meaning of this act. Now, this requires every employer to have a notice board, put up the provisions of this act, put up this at a prominent place, do this, do that, maintain records, file returns, etc., and there's no threshold. At least under the Act, I hope under the rules I have finally notified they might make some threshold. But at the moment, as I read the Act, there's no threshold at all, and this can work very harshly for small employers in markets, in wholesale mandis, and here and there, and adatiyas and whatnot. So it will just lead to an Inspector Raj, people coming and filing criminal complaints, filing all kinds of claims, and the inevitable bribing and all the rest of it would happen. I think this provision really is a bad provision in the sense that there should be a threshold for maintenance of records. There should be a threshold where you have 50 or more, then so-and-so record, where you have 200 or more, then so-and-so record, where you have 1,000 or more, then so-and-so record. There must be some threshold, because you can't expect an employer with 5 or 10 or 15 employees to maintain records and all that of the nature that they want all these complicated registers, etc., etc. But what is really, really, really obnoxious here is what comes next. And this is chapter 7, which has only one section, 51. Now, this is interesting. 51 deals with what they call the inspector cum facilitator. And one would have thought that, with their ease of doing business and all, facilitator would really be somebody to facilitate. But there is nothing at all in this section which makes this inspector cum facilitator do any facilitating. On the contrary, what they have done in subsection 6 of section 51 is to give search and seizure powers to the inspector cum facilitator. Now, this is very, very dangerous. Earlier, inspectors could summon records, they could demand records, they could summon them, etc., etc. Search and seizure powers means that it says basically that subject to provisions of subsection 4, the inspector cum facilitator may search, seize, or take copies of such register, record of wages, or notices or portions thereof as the inspector cum facilitator may consider relevant in respect of an offence under this code, and which the inspector cum facilitator has reason to believe has been committed by the employer. And then further it says that the provisions of Code of Criminal Procedure 1973 shall so far as may be applied to search or seizure under subsection 5, as they apply to search or seizure made under the authority of a warrant issued under section 94 of the said code. Now, this is a very, very dangerous provision. To give an ordinary labor inspector search and seizure powers on par with section 94 of the Code of Criminal Procedure is like making him a police officer, and even a police officer has to have a warrant. Here there's search and seizure with no warrant, nothing. He can just barge in, do whatever he likes, and this is going to be a charter an absolute license for anarchy in the implementation of this particular code. Then again in chapter 8, where it deals with offences and penalties, section 53 and 54 provide that for the purpose of imposing penalties under certain provisions, the government may appoint any officer not below the rank of Under Secretary to the Government of India or officer of equivalent rank in the state government for holding inquiry. So now penalties of 50,000 rupees, 30,000 rupees, 40,000 rupees, etc. can be imposed by a babu, by an Under Secretary. And instead of a judicial officer deciding that you have committed an offence, that babu, that government officer is going to hold an inquiry, decide you have committed an offence, and penalize you. Short of imprisonment, imprisonment powers have not been vested in the babu. But short of imprisonment, the entire gamut of monetary penalties under this code can be implemented under section 53 and 54 by a person nominated by a government who is only Under Secretary rank. Again, I think this is a provision which can only be called ugly in the extreme. There's no other word for it. It is completely incomprehensible to me how they have done this. So I don't know whether Abraham Lincoln's words would come true, but in our country I wouldn't hold my breath for that. But Abraham Lincoln famously said that the best way to get a bad law repealed is to enforce it strictly. But I personally have my doubts about whether we whether in our nation bad laws would get repealed by strict enforcement. In fact, they might strict enforcement just might lead to such so much of bribery and so much of lucre finding its way into the hands of inspectors and government servants of various ranks like Under Secretaries and so on, that there would be no incentive whatsoever to do away with this code or to do away with the worst provisions of the code. So I think broadly this is what I wanted to say on the provisions of the code and giving you a sort of a holistic bird's eye view of it. I'll now throw it open to Anil. Mr. Anil Bhatt said that he might lead me through certain aspects on which he felt that some clarification might be needed, or the questions which come from the audience.
Thank you so much. I think, again, whenever we speak and whenever we listen to you, it's a crash course always on any issue or any subject. And as I understand what you have spoken on this broadly, that gender discrimination aspect that has been addressed reasonably, and it's the implementation that will be very important to really watch. And second is that production bonus that has not been attended to, given importance, because production is something which is very important, looking at now that section 31A from that perspective. Third is that working journalists, sales promotion employees have been included in the definition of worker. Nominations, yes, a lot of litigation will be over. We have experienced that a lot of litigation was happening because there was no nomination, and there were many people claiming for the amounts. What's more important, what I have observed, what you have addressed beautifully, that if the adjudication powers are given to an officer, not to the judiciary, we have faced so much of problem. If you remember that ShopSec, a lot of states have the adjudication powers to deal with the termination cases, and where the one officer and one step up officers, they have the powers of appeal. We are facing a lot of challenges there when the adjudication, the understanding the nuances or principles of adjudication, we face a lot of difficulties, and ultimately we land before the high courts to really correct what we really face. And more again also, that have we gone back to the maintenance of records manually. We have always been talking about that let's go from manual to digital. So when we talk about this code, talks about the maintenance of registers, muster rolls, and then returns. We have to watch out whether we can still go digital or we have to go manual. And what's more important is that unbridled powers given to the inspectors. And are we actually rewinding it and going back to those times when it was an inspector Raj and the business was facing a lot of challenges? I think this is broadly what I have understood, and it's a beautiful analysis of broad analysis of the code. I think I will now read the questions if other people, I think what I understand is that people may have questions on the wages, because wages have been made uniform, and there may be questions on that when you talk about the other acts having different definitions, and what happens to the existing structure. And also very important is that a lot of statutes, compliances like EPF, ESI, that actually applies differently. Now, what's going to happen now when the definition is uniform, but EPF, ESI, other acts, so how do we deal with that? And I think I will read the questions, and then I think that will be a beautiful opportunity when we can hear from you the actual the answers to that. There's one question. How does the code deal with the appropriate government, the central government and state government? Would this apply uniformly to all the aspects like wages, minimum wages, and bonus? I think the gentleman is talking about the appropriate government, what has been defined in the Act. So that is like
Yes.
telecom and the other, insurance. So I think he's talking from that perspective. And more so, I would add to this question that they have talked about the establishment of contractors, established for such purpose. So I have a question which I'll take the liberty to add to this question, that let's say we have a contractor who deploys people at two different organizations, where the appropriate government is central government and the other is state government. So what is that will apply? Does it apply differently to its employees when deployed at different places?
Right. So let me perhaps I should deal with the first question which came from the member of the audience.
Yes.
The appropriate government is defined in Section 2D, and it's more or less the usual formula that those establishments by or under the authority of the central government: railways, mines, oil fields, major ports, air transport services, telecommunications, banking, insurance companies, corporations established by central acts, central public sector undertakings, companies owned and or controlled by the companies and autonomous bodies owned or controlled by central government, etc., are central government, and any other establishment is state government. But what they added in this was, in the central government definition, they said, including establishment of contractors for the purposes of such establishment. I think that's what Anil was asking. I'll come to that subsequently. But now the question from the audience was that how will this apply so far as different aspects of the code are concerned? Now, minimum wages, for instance, are to be done state-wise, because if you see the chapter on minimum wages that starts from Section 5, and there's a floor wage. The scheme here is, broadly speaking, that the central government can fix a floor wage, and the floor wage can also take into account regions and areas and so on. So once they fix a floor wage, the states which fall within that region or area where they have fixed the floor wage, the states have to fix the minimum wages. But the states cannot fix a minimum wage lower than that floor rate. They can fix a minimum wage higher than the floor rate, but not lower than the floor rate of the fixed by the central government. So basically, it says after giving the components of wages and so on and so forth, it says the appropriate government will appoint committees, appropriate government will fix the wages, etc., etc. And then, where is this provision? There's a provision which deals with the central government fixing a floor rate. I've somehow missed out which, I haven't jotted down that particular provision, but it's there. And yeah, sorry, at section 9, it says, section 9, the central government shall fix floor wage, taking into account minimum living standards of a worker in such manner being prescribed, provided that different floor wage may be fixed for different geographical areas. And then it says a minimum rate of wages fixed by the appropriate government under section 6 shall not be less than the floor wage. And if the minimum rate of wages fixed by appropriate government earlier is more than floor wage, then they shall not reduce it. In other words, just because the floor wage is lower than what they had fixed earlier, they won't reduce it. So the broad division of labor, I'm using the word labor loosely, the broad division of labor between the central government and state government is quite similar in this act to what it was under the Minimum Wages Act 1948, except for this floor wage concept. The central government comes in and it also has an advisory body under section 42, as I pointed out. And the central government can fix a floor wage, and then that floor wage becomes the bare minimum. Now, we don't know how this will play out actually in practice, but there are some states which have very, very high minimum wages, like NCT of Delhi, state of Kerala, Himachal Pradesh, etc. There are some states. Kerala, I think, might be one of the highest, or NCT of Delhi may be the highest. But there are some states which are 1/3. The minimum wages are 1/3 of what it is in Kerala or in Himachal. So now there is a feeling that it should, even in a poor state, it should not be so low. It should not be so low that it's 1/3 of what in another state, because then there's a lot of migration which happens because labor from states like Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, UP go rushing off to Kerala to work, or to Goa, or to Himachal Pradesh, and so on. So there is this. So perhaps to address that, they've come up with this. But broadly speaking, the appropriate government concept is standard for all provisions under the Act, but the appropriate government has a different role to play in the different chapters. So you will have to study it chapter wise and see what is the provision in minimum wages, what is the provision in chapter 2 minimum wages, chapter 3 payment of wages, chapter 4 bonus, and so on and so forth. One would have to see what is the role of appropriate government in each one of them. That role might vary, but appropriate government concept and definition remains the same. That's one. Two is the question which Anil had posed, Mr. Bhatt had posed, was that what is this concept of the employer, the contractor, and his role in the appropriate government? Now, this is something rather odd, because in the definition of employer, contractor is also defined as an employer, because it says a definition of employer in section 2L says employer means A, B, C, D, E, and includes subclause 3 contractor. So contractor can be an employer also, contractor can be a contractor for an employer also. It's a sort of a schizophrenic kind of situation. But what it says here is that appropriate government, in the case of central government, it says including establishment of contractors for the purpose of such establishment. Now, this is something where, as I said, they try to be all things to all men, or all things to all people. So, in the Contract Labor Act was amended, if I'm not wrong, in the year 1986, because there was a lot of discrepancy arising, because the principal employer might be central government, or principal employer might be state government, and contractor might fall under the other category. So it would be, people would have to raise two disputes to sort out a problem where a contract labor was involved and so on, or trade unions would have this problem. So what they did was in 86, if I'm not wrong, they amended the Contract Labor Act appropriate government definition to say that the appropriate government for contract labor would be the appropriate government of the principal employer. Now, that was a workable arrangement, because what it meant was that if there's a, let's say for the sake of argument, let's say Mind is a labor supplier. Let's say they've got some large scale, one of their segments is to supply manpower. Now, when they supply manpower to an airline company or to a bank, the appropriate government for that manpower while they are deployed in that particular airline company or that particular bank or LIC or wherever they've been deployed, the appropriate government will be central government. When they supply manpower to Mahindra and Mahindra or Tata Iron and Steel Company or Birla Jute or something, the appropriate government will be the state government of the establishment where they. So that was a very workable arrangement from after seeing from 1970 to 1986 the difficulties which had arisen. They amended and they brought about this cohesive thing. Here they've done something very strange. That's why I said there's clumsy drafting. They have put in this thing, including establishment of the contractor. Now, if the establishment of the contractor can't change its appropriate government, it is the contract labor who are deployed in a particular establishment. So now, for instance, if you have what Mr. Bhatt was pointing out was the establishment of the contractor. Let us say the contractor is a very large manpower company based in Bangalore. For the sake of argument. Now, appropriate government of that establishment will naturally be the state government, but they deploy people to Hindustan Aeronautics Limited in Bangalore. So when they deploy people to Hindustan Aeronautics, the establishment of the contractor will become central government. This is going to lead to a nightmare because that same large-scale manpower supply company might be supplying to Hindustan Aeronautics, to Bangalore Municipal Corporation, to so and so, to so and so, to so and so, and to large number of establishments which are not central government establishments. So this is this is just absolutely clumsy draftsmanship. And in the definition of wages, again they've put in something of this sort, where they've said I think in somewhere in the definition of no, sorry, not in wages, but yeah, sorry, where it says employer, in the definition of employer, it says and includes the contractor. Now, if the contractor is an employer, then how can there be a situation where the contractor is an employer, but the appropriate government of the contractor, who is himself an independent employer, is somebody else's appropriate government? And also, while fixing, in the payment of wages section, there's some provision which creates the same sort of confusion, because it says that where the wages are paid for the employees who are working in the contractor's establishment, there it is the contractor alone who's liable. So, in other words, a contractor can be deploying some people and utilizing some people for their own work. So, which is sensible. I mean, if you are using people for your own work, naturally in your establishment they'll be your employees and you'll be liable for them. But then all the more reason, if you're an employer, then your appropriate government has to be fixed on you, not on the basis of one or two establishments where you may have deployed people.
Thank you so much, sir. There's one more question. Why have they defined employee and worker differently? Why didn't they? Is there any specific purpose? They could have actually summed up in one provision that who's, like we have in the Industrial Disputes Act, who's a workman. So they have defined the worker and they have defined the employee. These are two separate provisions. So any specific reason for doing that?
I can't really, I have not fully understood the reason, but what I could divine, what I could deduce from this is that especially for certain provisions like Section 3, which deals with gender discrimination and equal remuneration, they wanted it to apply across the board to everybody who is in employment. That is right from the managing director downwards, because it says employee means any person employed to do any semi-skilled, unskilled, manual, operational, supervisory, managerial, administrative, technical, or clerical work for hire or reward, whether the terms of employment be expressed or implied, and also include the person declared to be an employee by the appropriate government. I don't know why they put this in, because
Yes.
the first part is so comprehensive, it virtually covers everybody anyway.
That's right.
But still they've added one more, but does not include a member of the armed forces of the union. Now, if you see section 3 uses the phrase, uses the word, there shall be no discrimination in an establishment or any unit thereof among employees on the ground of gender, in matters relating to wages by the same employer, in respect of the same work or work of a similar nature done by any employee. And then it says, no employer shall, for the purpose of so and so, reduce the wages of any employee or make any discrimination on the ground of sex while recruiting any employee for the same work or work of a similar nature, etc. So I think there are certain provisions they intended should apply across the board to managerial, supervisory, administrative, the whole gamut. Whereas there are other provisions where, for instance, payment of bonus, they say that the appropriate government may fix a wage ceiling at the very first section dealing with bonus in part 4. Gives them a power to fix a wage ceiling and thereby exclude people from getting a bonus. So some provisions perhaps they intended that, but again, bonus also applies to every employee. But it says there shall be paid to every employee drawing wages not exceeding such amount per mensum as determined by notification by the appropriate government. So for bonus, they intend that state government or central government can fix a wage ceiling and then deny the bonus to those who are above that limit. But again, they have not made it different for workers. But some provisions they have specifically confined to workers. So if I'm not wrong, perhaps a payment of wages section is applicable to workers. No, even there it says employee. I think I myself this is a very, very good question, but I think I myself will need to do a slightly deeper study to determine why. I had assumed that it was mainly for gender discrimination and other things that they wanted to include everyone, but they have used the phrase employee in most of the other sections, most of the other provisions.
Thank you so much, sir. There is a provision which says that section 17, they say that the full and final has to happen within time that's not more than 2 days. So now the
Yes.
question, now the question is that let's say if the person has not handed over the charge or he has some notice pay has still to be recovered. So whether these two days, where from that date that will run. So is that the authority is going to really catch me that the person has been terminated now that I am supposed to pay, irrespective of the fact whether he has handed over the charge or he has not? Or this could be a good bona fide reason of not paying him by that time.
Well, so you're right. Section 17(2) says where an employee has been removed or dismissed from service or retrenched or resigned from service or become unemployed due to closure of this, wages shall be paid within 2 working days of his removal, dismissal, retrenchment, or as the case may be, his resignation. So, what this will mean in practice is that employers will have to, sort of fully line up their ducks before they shoot the gun, because they'll have to do all the calculations, work out everything, etc., and only then let the act fall. Because, of course, keep in mind, this is only dealing with wages. This is not dealing with other dues like, gratuity and bonuses and various other forms of remuneration which may be payable to the employee. This section 17 only deals with wages, and wages excludes, as I said, there's a very complicated definition of wages which excludes a large number of things. So, this will only be the wages, and normally wages are only in arrears for that month. In most cases, normally you'll find that at the time of termination, 1 month's wages or half a month's wages or whatever if the person has worked for 10 days of that month or 20 days, only that wage is payable because you have already paid the previous month's wages in normal cases. So I guess it really means that that an employer will have to do all the maths and all the calculations before shooting off the gun.
Thank you so much, sir. There is a provision, section 6, that talks about wage period of by hour, by day, by month. But we have a concept of weekly also in India. If you remember, we did one matter in Patna High Court, footwear
Yes.
industry, where the
Yes.
the payment is made every week. So does it
Yeah,
mean
but
that I cannot do it every
No,
week?
but that is provided here. That is provided here also. This is this is the minimum rate of wages on time work basis may be fixed on the following wage period.
Right.
So even if your payment schedule is weekly, it will still be weekly, but you will be paying it on a daily rate, I guess.
Right.
Because if you see further, there's a specific provision somewhere. There was a specific provision which said that it will be paid. Yeah, if you see section 17.1 now, we were looking at 17.2 for dismissal. 17.1
Yes.
says the employer shall pay or cause to be paid. Employer shall pay or cause to be paid wages to the employees engaged on daily basis at the end of the shift, weekly basis on the last working day of the week. That is to say, before the weekly holiday, fortnightly basis before the end of the second day after the end of fortnight, monthly basis before the expiry of so and so. So basically, the provision which you was drawing my attention to, Anil, was the manner in which minimum wages are to be fixed.
That's right.
So minimum wages are to be fixed on a daily basis, or what is it, daily, weekly, whatever. Minimum rate of wages shall be by the hour. So you can have an hourly rate, a daily rate, or a monthly rate. But your periodicity of payment can be weekly, fortnightly, monthly, daily, whatever. So the one is the fixation of the rate for fixing minimum wages, and one is the periodicity by which you have to pay the amount. So they are both provided in two different sections. One is in the chapter dealing with minimum wages, the other is in the chapter dealing with payment of wages.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. There is one very important, I was referring to that we come back to the wages, because I think everyone is looking at that question.
Yeah.
Now that the wages have been made uniform and many components have been taken out. Now it is, earlier the different acts had different exclusions. Or if I say that Provident Fund Act or the Payment of Bonus Act, so the not universally paid or for the time being paid, that concept is not given in this definition of wage now. So now, can I restructure my wages at this time before this act comes in force, or immediately thereafter, even if I have to really follow the requirements of the ID Act? Because this now new structure really gives a new way to compliances, applicability of PF, bonus, or ESI. So that may have an effect now. How do I deal with that? Because I have an existing structure.
So the problem really is going to be that this code only deals with 4 acts and repeals 4 acts. This code does not repeal the ID Act, it does not repeal the Provident Fund Act, it does not repeal the Payment of Gratuity Act, it does not repeal or deal with so many other plethora of statutes, Employee State Insurance Act, etc., all of which have separate definitions of wages, etc. Now, like Provident Fund Act uses the concept of basic pay or basic wages. ESI has a different definition of wage. Industrial Disputes Act has a different definition, etc. Payment of Gratuity Act has a different definition. It excludes certain allowances which are included in others. So this code does not, unfortunately, deal with all those. It would have been really ideal if they had formulated those 3 or 4 codes at one time and tried to streamline them all and bring their definitions as far, at least definitions. I can understand your other provisions may be very different from each other, but at least definitional clauses should be broadly similar, because you have such divergent things. And of course, as a lawyer, I can't complain, and nor can you, Anil. You can't complain about this, because the more of this discrepancy, the more work we get. but at the end of the day, in the interest of industry and in the interest of making things work smoothly, they really ought to have framed all the laws. They may not have brought them all into force, but they should have framed them so that there can be a debate and discussion and streamlining and improvements can take place and all that. Now, since this wage definition is here, now under this wage definition, you can have 50% of your wage can be given in excluded allowances, right? And if you give, it's only if the excluded allowances exceed 50%, then the amount in excess of 50% will be treated as part of the remuneration, which is wages. But that does not mean that Section 9A of the Industrial Disputes Act has gone for a toss. That is still there. Now, under Section 9A, you cannot change the wages without issuing a notice of change of 21 days. And the Supreme Court says any change introduced without a notice of change will be void ab initio and ineffective. So, in spite of this law coming into force, you will still face the problem that you can't take advantage of this and make that change except by bringing about a settlement or something. Now, of course, there's that absurd thing of subclause G of Section 2Y, which says that anything which is payable under settlement or award or by a court or tribunal is not even remuneration. It's not wages at all. I don't know how we are going to reconcile that. But the fact of the matter is that you will not be able to implement those changes unless you have the cooperation of the trade unions or so as to arrive at settlements, or you get an award to do it, because otherwise Section 9A will come in your way.
Thank you, sir. So absolutely correct, because though they have tried to make it uniform, they have still, if we see Section 26, they talk about bonus and they talk about 100 rupee. So that shows that the mind has not been completely applied here.
Yeah, I saw that. I was actually shocked.
Yes,
I was
right.
actually shocked when I saw that 8 and 1/3% of the wages earned by the employee, or 100 rupees, whichever is higher.
That is something,
because 100 rupees would only be higher if your wages are less than 800 rupees per year.
Right, and that goes, minimum wage concept goes for a toss there.
800 rupees per year, not even per month, actually. And minimum wages in Kerala or in NCT of Delhi might be 800 rupees per day for you.
That's right, sir. There's one more provision, sir. One question is coming. Section 6, while fixing the minimum rate of wages. Now, when we talk about fixing the floor wages by the central government, they will take into account the geographical, area. And then they again talk about when the state government will fix the minimum rate of wages, they may also take into account the geographical area or the arduous work people may do. So is that now a new concept is introduced, where the state government would also see that in a particular state, the geographical area, what does that mean? Does that have some bearing on it? Because that is...
Anil, we must keep in mind two things. One, actually, there is one very good provision in this code, especially from the point of view or the viewpoint of employees, that instead of earlier used all under the Minimum Wages Act 1948, the minimum wages are fixed occupation-wise. So they have to have a separate notification issued for restaurants. They have to have a separate one for shops. They have to have a separate one for pharmaceutical industry, for this industry, for that industry, etc. And many times they don't get revised for 10 years and 15 years because they don't have the time to consider so many different things. So what they've done in this code is that they have just clubbed everybody that minimum wages can be fixed across the board for all employees. And this is regardless of industries, etc., etc. But they have kept the geographical concept and that was there even under the 1948 Act. You have a zone. It used to be done in zones. So if they fix minimum wages for pharmaceutical industries in the state of Gujarat, let's say, they would have zone A, zone B, zone C, zone D, zone E, 4 zones, 5 zones, and Zone A might consist of metro cities, Zone B might consist of B towns, Zone C might consist of sort of small towns with 10,000 or 20,000 population. Zone D might consist of rural areas. So geographical sort of differentiation was always there. That remains. Now here the floor wage naturally. Central government has it says shall fix a floor wage in section 9 by taking into account minimum living standards of a worker in such manner as may be prescribed, provided that different floor wage may be fixed for different geographical areas. Now this needs to be there because you can't at the end of the day you can't have the same minimum same floor wage for Bihar as for Kerala or for Himachal Pradesh or someplace like that, because the floor wage, if you made it very low in Kerala, it would be meaningless because all their minimum wages would be twice and thrice the floor wage. If you made it very high, then it would cause a lot of difficulty to Bihar or Odisha or Jharkhand. So as a result of that, I think geographical some geographical differentiation has to be there. So that flexibility has to be left to the appropriate government.
Thank you, sir. There is one very interesting legalistic question. The code defines an industrial dispute.
Yes.
So the question is, what does it mean? Why they have any purpose? Why they have defined industrial dispute? Is this for the eligibility context where the reference is made, or what is the purpose? Or an individual claim cannot be filed, or it's to be filed collectively?
I don't think so. I don't read it that way. I think they, because they wanted an employee to be covered even while they are, if you see section 2Z worker and you see 2Q industrial dispute. Now it's actually completely unnecessary. This definition of industrial dispute, because nowhere in the entire code do you find industrial dispute being used. But 2Q defines industrial dispute. 2Z says that worker means so and so, sales promotion employee, and for purposes of any proceeding under this code in relation to an industrial dispute includes any such person who has been dismissed, discharged, or retrenched or otherwise terminated in connection with or as a consequence of that dispute, or whose dismissal, discharge, or retrenchment has led to that dispute. Now they have just bodily lifted these definitions on the Industrial Disputes Act, but the code does not anywhere deal with industrial disputes in the rest of the main actual provisions of the code, whether it's in Minimum Wages Act, Payment of Wages Act, or Payment of Bonus Act, or Equal Remuneration Act. They are not dealing with industrial disputes. So I don't know why they've bodily lifted, but these are the two places where this concept of industrial dispute pops up.
Could be a reason that where the eligibility or fixation of bonuses, in question, like section 46, where in that case the claim would not lie before this appropriate authority, but it has to be referred to the industrial adjudicator under ID Act or under the payment.
I'm very grateful to you for reminding me of that. I missed mentioning that, but that is again, I think it's one of the bad provisions of this code, that if you are making a code to deal with Payment of Wages Act, Payment of Bonus Act, Minimum Wages Act, and Equal Remuneration Act, why should you leave the issue of adjudication of bonus to the ID Act? There should have been one. I'm not saying the section 45 and 49 adjudicator, because they are gazetted officers who I think that's a provision which is likely to get struck down. But they should have set up a tribunal under this code for all the purposes of the code. Why should, for one aspect of to send it under a different statute where everything is, where the whole machinery is different, the definitions are different, the things are different, and we know the adjudications of under the ID Act, the payment of bonus adjudications go on forever. So I don't know why that has been done. I think it's really something they should have avoided. What is the point of leaving, when you're consolidating and codifying the law, why leave one thing to be done in some other machinery under some other law.
I think we are also running out of time. Then one more question. To our understanding that payment of bonus, there is no that cap now, eligibility. So earlier Payment of Bonus Act would apply to employees who were earning salary, the wages up to 21,000. Now
Yep,
this code does not.
They have left it to the appropriate government because Section 26 says there shall be paid to every employee drawing wages not exceeding such amount per mensem as determined by notification by the appropriate government. So, so they have now put the ceiling. They've left the ceiling to the appropriate government to decide. So, central government may decide one ceiling. State governments may decide another ceiling. I think again, it was totally unnecessary. If you have a central law, why not just have a uniform ceiling? Now, one state will put the ceiling at 1 lakh, one state will put the ceiling at 10,000. Now, what happens if you have a situation where there's a company with 20 branches all over India, right? Now, different states will have different bonus ceilings. So, in the same company, you will have half the employees are getting bonus, half the employees are not getting bonus.
That's right.
It's very clumsy draftsmanship. Very clumsy draftsmanship. Somehow it turns out to be sort of neither fish nor fowl. They try to cover all kinds of things and they've tied themselves up in knots, unfortunately, on certain aspects.
Right, sir. So there is one. You were talking about disqualification of receiving bonus. We refer to Section 30. So there they have included sexual harassment also as a ground for not paying. Section 29.
Section 29. An employee shall be disqualified from receiving bonus no, but that's only in cases of dismissal. See, Section 29 is dealing with dismissed employees and saying a dismissed employee who is dismissed for fraud, riotous or violent behavior, theft, misappropriation, or conviction of sexual harassment, that employee will be disqualified for bonus.
So, would there be any requirement?
The other one which I was talking about was in Section 30.
That was a forfeiture. That was a forfeiture.
That is Section 38. That where in any accounting year an employee is found guilty of misconduct causing financial loss to the employer, then it shall be lawful for the employer to deduct the amount of loss from the amount of bonus payable to him by him to the employee under this code in respect of that accounting year only, and the employee shall be entitled to receive the balance if any. So this is for an ongoing employee, not a dismissed employee. But let's say somebody has done some caused a loss. Say a person has done something for which you won't dismiss him. A person takes conveyance allowance and you find out that he's actually gone on his brother-in-law's motorbike and he's charged you for TATA for traveling and taken taxi fare of 3,000 rupees or 5,000 rupees. So you'll say that, okay, this is he cheated by taking 3,000 or 5,000 taxi fare even though he went as a pillion with somebody else. But I'm not going to dismiss the chap for that. Okay, I'll recover that from his bonus. Something of that sort.
Adding something here itself. So when you talk about fraud, riotous or violent behavior, so would it be required that we have to first conduct an inquiry, find him guilty, or I can, I have to make
see, this is if he is dismissed from service for so and so. Now you can't, with the law as it's developed in our country, you can't dismiss them for these things without holding an inquiry, unless, of course, now conviction for sexual harassment, then you don't have to hold a separate inquiry because he's already convicted. Or if there's a fraud of such a nature which leads to loss of confidence, then you don't hold an inquiry because you're specifically terminating for loss of confidence. Then you may say that that's a dismissal for loss of confidence. But generally speaking, a dismissal from service for ABC of this at least would always be preceded by an inquiry.
Now again, Kapil, just taking liberty to really add one more here. If you remember payment of gratuity, forfeiture on the ground of moral turpitude, the Supreme Court recently said there has to be a conviction first. So would it be required here also for not paying or disqualifying him for receiving
No, this categorically says that an employee, this law itself says that shall be disqualified from receiving if he is dismissed for so and so. So there's
That's
no
right.
question of requiring a conviction for it.
Okay.
Because the provision is very clear in itself that dismissal from service for fraud, for riotous or violent behavior will result in disqualification. And dismissal would have to be preceded by an inquiry is a different matter. But there's another aspect here which didn't strike me earlier, but since you draw my attention to it, this talks about an employee. Now, employee includes a manager, administrator, etc. Now, for a managerial person, you may not hold an inquiry because they are not covered by Standing Orders Act, etc. And generally speaking, with senior managerial employees, people don't hold inquiries. They just issue them a show cause notice, or they issue them a letter and they get their explanation and they sack them. So there may be those cases of dismissal for fraud or riotous or a theft or misappropriation of a manager, which is not preceded by an inquiry, but yet there would be a forfeiture of bonus.
Now, just last question, sir. This code has introduced the concept of compounding of offenses. So does it mean that it has reduced the rigors of penalty? That the employers would be a bit more complacent? That, well, if there is something, they would compound, or there is an option of rectification of what they have non-complied with. So what is your thought on that?
That with regard to compounding, no, I think compounding ought to be there in this thing. We have got a situation in India where our courts are flooded already. These prosecutions, sometimes the prosecutions are so trivial. A prosecution for not putting up a notice under the standing orders, or a notice giving the what are the weekly off days, can be prosecuted under Factories Act, or there are prosecutions which go on forever. And as they say, that the process is the punishment. The process of facing that prosecution itself becomes a punishment.
That's right.
So ultimately, I think to have compounding provisions, it makes a lot of sense, because the kind of prosecutions that go on, the court should not be clogged with that, and employers should not be made to face that for half of the things which go on.
For me, I'm done. Thank you so much. I think again, I say, we have been learning in person when we are with you, or through the judgments we read where you have been involved. So I think thank you so much again. I think
thank you everybody for
if there are any questions, they can mail us the questions and we can send the replies to those questions. I'll just give it back to Mr. Sameer. Thank you so much, sir, again.
Thank you, and I thank the whole audience for being very patient and spending their Friday evening like this.
Yeah, thank you all participants for having a very patient, and I'm sure that they would have been, they would have enjoyed the session and got some good clarifications. Thank you so much again, Mr. Sameer. I think your voice is, you're not audible, Mr. Sameer.
Am I audible now?
Yes, please.
So thank you, Mr. Singh. Thank you, Mr. Bhatt. Thank you so much for the session. It was very engaging, very informative. Absolute pleasure to hearing both of you have a conversation, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much again. Thank you to the audience. Sorry for some of the technical issues, but thank you for your patience. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as we enjoyed hosting Mr. Bhatt and Mr. Singh. The webinar will be available on demand on the Mind. We've recorded the webinar, so it'll be available for all of you on the Mind LinkedIn page. We will also be sending all of you a link of the webinar to your email IDs for you to listen to it as well. So I'll close the webinar. Thank you so much, sirs, gentlemen. It was an absolute honor to have you today. Talk on this session. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Do stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.